welcome everybody. Thanks for coming in. We're going to get started right now. This is part of the How to Podcast live series, with the University FM and a few other folks. Joining me today is going to be Frances Johnson, and she's going to come on the screen a little later, introduce herself. But today's session is all about how to plan your podcast stories. And we're going to get the deck up here. All right. So just before we get into the content and all, I want to say this is meant to be an interactive session. So on the right hand side, if you're new to Crowdcast, there's a few features here. You can use the chat or the Q&A features, or you could even make a poll. I don't think we're gonna do that today, but if you have any questions during this session, please go ahead and ask them and we'll answer them live. All right, let's go to the next one. So introductions here. If I have not met you yet, I'm the co-founder and owner of University FM. And basically what we do is we work with higher ed teams to help them make their own podcast shows and to really elevate the voices of their institution. So that's the production, the distribution behind it, and really telling stories that resonate with your community. And with me today, again, is Frances. So Frances coming over from University of Utah, over at the Eccles School of Business. And Frances, you want to say a few more words?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Sorry, I'm just getting over a little cold, but as Robert mentioned, I'm Frances. I'm the manager of Alumni Marketing and Communications at the David Eccles School of Business here in Salt Lake City, Utah, at the University of Utah, and I'm so happy to be here.
I'm very grateful and glad to have Frances here, even though she has a cold. She told me a few minutes ago she got it 2 days ago because her kids are back in school, so it's that that type of achiness. But thank you for being here, Frances.
My pleasure.
All right. So go on to the next slide. Oh, and sorry, I'll also say you'll see on the previous slide that Frances also hosts the Eccles Business Buzz podcast, and that is the podcast we're going to be talking a lot about today. And is coming from the Eccles School of Business. All right. As a part of this session, we made a takeaway doc that you can use. It's going to really tie closely what we're going to talk about in the agenda. But if you scan that QR code in the bottom left, you'll be able to see the school documents with a few exercises for you to think about if you're thinking about doing your own show or thinking about how to improve your podcast planning process. All right. And we can go to the next slide. I'll just say, this QR code is going to be on the bottom left-hand screen for a while, so scan that whenever you like. So today's agenda, we're going to be talking about three things. There's kind of three big questions here. Who's listening? What's the through line, and what do we talk about and with who? So when we're thinking about planning podcast stories or any sort of creative decision for a podcast, we always ground that in what would our audience or our listener find interesting, or what would our listener need or want. So first, it's all about defining the audience for the podcast or the community around the podcast, and then from there, establishing some overarching themes for maybe the season, the show itself, and even at the episode level. So that's where episode criteria comes in. And the last part here, after we have some themes and episode criteria, how to actually go about selecting episode topics and guests for our show. All right, so first up, who is listening? This is, whenever we work on a new podcast or maybe it's an existing show that wants to do a little revamp or just improve, this is the first step, just having clarity on who is listening. So on the slide, on the very top, you have a few broad questions to help define the audience. And then in this chart here is an exercise where we define different audience groups. And after defining those audience groups, ranking them from high, medium to low. And the theory here is by focusing on whichever audience group is high, then the rest will come with it, right? But we will make sure that our stories are tailored, right, for the target audience or for the primary target audience. So some of these questions, is it an internal or external audience? So in a university or organizational context, I mean, internal audience in terms of students or faculty or alumni, and the external audience would be more broader community, maybe within your city, or like other partners, right, outside of the university. Two, where a listener already have knowledge of the subject matter or what you're talking about. So this is helping you determine, okay, whatever topic we pick, how in depth do we want to get into it? And then this last one here, what is your audience looking for? What should they take away? And even, after somebody listens to your show, how do you want them to feel? All right. So with this chart here, Francis, could you tell us a little bit about how these audience groups were defined for Eccles Business Buzz?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned before, I'm in the Alumni Relations and Development Office. So, really, our focus is on the alumni base of the Eccles School, which is around 40,000 alums, and then also donors to the business school. So, that's really who we targeted as our key audiences. And part of how we determined our audience was also by defining some goals that we had for the podcast. We wanted to inspire people. So we wanted to share stories of alumni, of students, of faculty who were just doing really incredible things. We want we wanted to engage. So one purpose of our podcast is to provide a connection point for alums so that they can be engaged with the school. So that's another reason why they're our highest target audience. Then we had the goal to convert. So we want to take alumni, we want to make them engaged alumni, and then we want to turn them into donors to the school at any amount. And then our final goal was to diversify. So equity, diversity, and inclusion is a key strategic initiative of the Eccles School. And we saw the podcast as an opportunity to really highlight and amplify some diverse voices and experiences. Those goals for the podcast align with the goals that we have as an office as well. And so based on those goals, our audiences kind of shook out from there. So our main goal is to engage with alumni. So they became our primary audience. We also have an initiative at the Eccles School called Alum from Day One, where we just try to really make students aware that they are alums from the day that they come to the Eccles School. And so current students are also part of our highest priority audience. From there, we moved to donors and other Eccles School partners. So these are people who are already engaged, but maybe we can use the podcast as an opportunity to show them a little love. If they're a donor to the school, show gratitude for that partnership and highlight it in a way that's kind of mutually beneficial. Then faculty and staff, we do feature a lot of faculty research on the podcast. So we certainly want it to be something that is appealing to them to be a part of. And then finally, prospective students and the wider business community as that sort of final catch-all to, people who we would love to capture if we can.
Yeah, so Francis, you brought up an excellent point about, even before this conversation with audience is having clarity on the goals for the podcast and why the podcast exists. And then it seems like in this case, that's where the the audience definition came from, right? So it's really tied closely. I want to talk a little bit also about how for Eccles Business Buzz, the audience has kind of expanded, or slowly changed over time. So could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So we, as we've been talking about, we set out originally to kind of capture an alumni audience and provide a touch point for them. The Eccles Business Buzz podcast was actually predates me. It was started during COVID, and it was sort of a replacement for in-person events that couldn't be happening. And so alumni had always been kind of the target audience of the podcast. But as we've been able to have in-person engagements with alumni, the goals and the target of the podcast have kind of shifted. And it became kind of clear to us that the people that we were able to have join us as guests on the podcast and the topics that we were generating were things that would be of interest beyond just alums of the school. So we found that the topics that were most interesting and that seemed to gain the most traction were things that were applicable to the wider business community, not only, news about the school or news that would only be interesting to alums. And so with that in mind, as we've brainstormed topics and as we've brainstormed guests as well, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, we've really started to cast a wider net. So whereas we used to only have alums as guests on the podcast, we've now expanded to guests who are maybe well known in the Utah business community to really try to elevate the podcast to be a source of information for people just beyond an audience that's connected to the school.
Yeah, okay, so that's a good segue. So let's go to the next slide here. And the next question right to answer is, okay, after we define the audience, that cleared on that, what's the through line, for all of our episodes and for what people should be expecting from the show as a whole. So just starting from the left here, let's cover a little bit about overarching themes. So there's three ways that we can think about this. One is, what are the themes at a show level? What are the themes at a seasonal level? And then what are themes for maybe a mini series, right? If that is a part of the podcast strategy. Francis, I'm going to ask you really quick. So from the show level, how would you define a theme? And then the season level, for this season in particular, how would you define it?
So the podcast, the Eccles Business Buzz podcast, is sort of married to our Eccles Experience magazine. The magazine comes out twice a year, every September and March, and each issue of the magazine is built around one of the 5 values of the David Eccles School of Business. So we carry whatever the theme was for the magazine over to the attached season of the podcast. So that's at a show level kind of where we start. We say, okay, what's the theme for the magazine? And now how do we carry that over into the show and the season? So I guess at the show level, it's, connected to the magazine. We know that broadly we're going to be following these values of the Eccles School. And then each season is a distinct value and it matches or sort of expands on the content that was in the magazine. Should I keep going?
Keep on going.
Okay. So that's kind of where we start. The first couple seasons that I did, we stuck with that sort of broad theme. So for example, the first season of the podcast that I hosted, the theme was continuous curiosity. So we had a professor, a faculty member at the Eccles School who studies mindfulness and workplace identity. We had some representatives of our executive education department talking about continuous learning. We had a CEO who is a partner of the school talking about sort of growth mindset within his own company. We had a scholarship donor and a scholarship recipient talking about the role of scholarships in providing opportunities for students to pursue their own curiosity. So we stuck with that pretty broad theme and found some different angles to approach it through the different kinds of episodes. More recently, we've been kind of experimenting with this idea of within that large theme, picking a very micro theme for the podcast. So this started, our current theme is empathetic global citizenship, which is very much tied to the work that the Eccles School is doing now in the equity, diversity, and inclusion space. And we had some things going on with a donor where it seemed appropriate to invite her to be a guest on the podcast. And it sparked this idea of what could she talk about? And we settled on this idea that, oh, she could talk about being a woman in the workplace, a woman business owner. And then I started thinking, oh, that might be kind of cool to do like a mini arc within the larger season and have several episodes of guests talking about the experiences of women in the workplace. And then as we brainstormed what guests we could invite to talk about that, it actually turned into a whole season. So this season, we're focused on a very micro part of the larger theme, which is the experience of women in the workplace and how that ties, how their experiences, what they learn, what they experience, how they're mentored, how all of that then relates back to that larger theme of empathy and empathetic leadership.
Wonderful. So at a very base level, so it's like the theme for the show and for seasons is really closely tied to the overall communication strategy. In this case, tied very closely with the magazine. And then as it developed, or as the season kind of as more ideas came in, it was a little evident. Okay, why not make a whole series right around women in the workplace? So there's a few ways that themes can be established for a show, and I'll just make a comment that when you're making these themes, typically, the more focused the theme, the better, because that sets a tighter, I guess, expectation, for listeners. I'm going to talk a little bit more now about the episode criteria on the right-hand side. So the idea here is after you have some overarching themes, when you start evaluating episode ideas and episode guest ideas, what are you looking at? Like what are you thinking about? These examples on the right are not actually related to Eccles Business Buzz, but there's some good examples from other shows. So some examples just to get you start thinking about episode criteria are guests that are maybe high profile, or maybe all guests to be high profile. And there's like a follow-up question to that. Okay, what does high profile mean, right, for the show? Maybe all the guests have to be alumni, if it's an alumni show, or if that's a key aspect of working, or the key aspect of the show existing. Timeliness. So in this case, this criteria would be, okay, all episodes would have to be relevant to what's happening today, but the show is not a news show, so they don't have to be, okay, immediately the day after reporting, maybe relevant at a higher level, right? So as you typically, as you work internally with your team and kind of crowdsource ideas, a lot of ideas are come up that you can't fit maybe in a 10 episode season or more than that. So you gotta be more selective. And this is just putting some words on paper for, okay, as a group, here is what we're going to select against. All right, let's go to the next slide. So, let's say so we answered the first question, which is our audience, having cleared in that. We answered the second question, which is, what are our show theme, what is our show theme or themes, and what are episode criteria. So now we can start talking about what do we want to talk about and with who. On this slide here, in this picture, is a screenshot from our episode logistics sheet. That's what we call it, but basically a document where we list out all of our episode topics and guests. So these are the topics and guests for this season of Eccles Business Buzz. And Francis, could you talk us through how you went about crowdsourcing these ideas and how these episodes were prioritized?
You bet. So choosing the guests for the season is really a collaborative effort across our whole team. Our team is made up of a small marketing team, which I'm a part of, a stewardship team. So those are the people who really take care of the donors, an alumni relations team, and a fundraising team. So once we have the theme identified for the season, I take it to the team and I say, okay, who are you working with? Who would be a good guest? Um, every season, there's at least one, often two carryovers from the magazine. So I already know people that I've interviewed for the magazine who are going to be featured in the magazine who would also be a good fit for the podcast. We do 8 episodes a season, so that means we usually have 6 more episodes to fill. So a fundraiser would say, for example, oh, I'm working right now with this person on a gift. They're interested in making a gift to the school. It would be awesome to engage with them in this way. And they have this expertise or experience that is related to the theme of the season. Um, Same with the alumni relations team. They might know of an alum who's serving on a board or who's been very active in another group who they want to engage further. And this would be a good opportunity to do that. So we, as a team, throw out the names, how they're connected, what they could talk about, and then we whittle it down if we come up with too many, which is a good problem to have. We whittle it down to who can fit in the season. We always have at the top of the season someone who can kind of present the theme from a more general standpoint. And that usually is a faculty member talking about their research. So that's the case here with Amelia Stillwell. She's a professor in our management department. We featured her research as the cover story in the magazine. And then she came on and talked about it to sort of set up the season in the first episode. In this case, the final episode of the season is also a staff member at the Eccles School. Katie Abbey is the Assistant Dean for Business Career Success. So we put her as a kind of bookend at the end, talking about, right, we've been talking the whole season about the challenges that women face in the workplace, the different difficulties that they've had, barriers that they've had to overcome. And now the final episode is a staff member talking about, hey, this is how here at the Eccles School, we are preparing all of our students, but in particular our female students, to be prepared to meet these challenges and to be prepared to really succeed in the workplace. So those were the two bookends, sort of framing the problem at the beginning, framing the solution at the end. From there, the episodes really shook out a little bit according to who could record when. And we did have a little thing that happened this season that I think is relevant to the order of things and kind of being flexible with your guests. So you'll see on this slide an episode with 2 guests, Susan Madsen and Nubia Pena. Susan Madsen runs the Women's Leadership Project at Utah State University, so another university here in Utah. And Nubia Pena works in the governor's office in the Office of Multicultural Affairs. I really wanted them to be at the beginning of the season because Susan's research is very much related to these statistics in Utah about poor experiences for women in the workplace. So I really wanted her to be part of framing that problem. But through many complicated logistical problems, her recording date kept getting pushed back and back and back. And we ended up having to put her at the end of the season. So we shifted her, Susan and Nubia's topic to, instead of framing the problem, to be part of the episodes of framing the solution. So out of Susan Madsen's research and her Leadership Institute, she developed a plan in conjunction with the governor's office called A Bolder Way Forward. And so instead of talking so much about the problems, we focused that episode on what is in the Bolder Way Forward plan and how can we move forward and make progress. Kate Kanyas, who's the second to last episode, similarly has a lot of research that's solution oriented. So we grouped those episodes at the end of the season to kind of wrap it up on a positive note and say, okay, we've heard about all these issues, all these different women's experiences, and now we're going to present kind of a suite of solutions to these problems. I will just say kind of finally that as we talked about the guests, we tried to find women who were either in different industries or different places in their careers, who had different experience. So it wasn't just kind of woman after woman saying, oh, it's so hard to be a woman in the workplace, which is true, but could get a little repetitive for 8 episodes. So Trina Celeste is in the tech industry. Heather Griffin Barber is an entrepreneur. Michelle Smith is a chief people officer for a very large company here, the Larry H. Miller Company. And Jennifer Robinson is actually a staff member at the Eccles School in the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute. So they were really focused on policies and initiatives that companies and other organizations can have to really nurture a sense of belonging for women and other minoritized groups in the workplace. And then Amy Frampton is in the C-suite. So she was really well positioned to talk about that difficulty of women reaching executive leadership and the challenges that they face when they're there. So even though we had this very micro topic of women in the workplace, we still tried to diversify the guest list as much as possible to provide as many different perspectives that would align with the different, right? We have entrepreneurs listening, we have women in tech listening. So trying to offer, even within a small theme, something that would be relevant to everyone who might be listening.
And just to help set some expectations, at least in your experience, how far advanced did you have to start planning?
I never start planning far enough in advance, is what I have learned. I personally like to have most of the season recorded before it starts airing. It's less stressful for me. That's not always possible, but I usually start planning the season between 2 and 3 months before the air date, and I try to start recording about 2 months before. That gives time for these little problems like we had with Susan and Nubia and their scheduling. And it just gets enough of the season kind of in the can before you start airing that you feel comfortable and not rushed to get it finished. And that is easy for us to do because we are working in conjunction with the magazine, which is a 6-month production cycle. So we know well in advance what the theme is that we're going to be using for the magazine and the podcast. And this is not a news podcast, so we don't have to, we can record in advance because we're not talking about things that will become outdated by the time the episode airs.
All right. Well, at this point, I'm going to open up for questions. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put in chat. And as we wait here, Francis, I got one more for you. So could you share, and this is cool, could you share a bit about how this like seasonal planning has allowed opportunity to work with the Utah magazine?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we started planning this season about women in the workplace, I really started thinking about this idea of, okay, how can we expand the podcast audience and reach beyond just people who are connected to the Eccles School? And this season felt like a good time to do it because many of our guests are actually not alums of the business school or connected to it. Most of them are connected to the University of Utah, but it was a little different from previous seasons in that not everyone was an alum or a donor or a staff or faculty member. In fact, Susan Madsen even does her research at a completely different university from ours. So because of that, and also because I think the topic of women in the workplace is something that people are always talking about, and it's something that's interesting to anyone in the workplace, not just members of the Eccles community. I reached out to a statewide publication, Utah Business Magazine. They cover business news on their website, and then they also give out a lot of awards and recognitions like 20 under 20, 40 over 40, women to watch, best companies to work for. This seemed like something that their readers would be particularly interested in. So I reached out to the editor-in-chief of the magazine, kind of told her what we were doing with the podcast, and asked if there was any way that we could collaborate to help promote the season and expand the reach. We were able to get an item about the podcast in the magazine itself. And then we brainstormed the idea of hosting a listening party in conjunction, kind of co-hosted by my office at the Eccles School and Utah Business Magazine, where they would leverage their lists, people who are connected in their network. We would leverage our network. So it would be a new audience for them, a new audience for us. Bring those people together with some snacks and some drinks, listen to an episode, and then have the guests on that episode sit on a panel moderated by the editor of Utah Business Magazine to talk in a little bit more depth about what was covered in the episode and open it up for questions. I'm really excited about it. We're looking to do it in mid-January after the madness of the holidays is over. And I think it's really cool for a couple reasons. It obviously gives us access to an audience that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. It gives Utah Business Magazine an event that they can host and be a part of. And I just love the idea of being able to talk a little bit more about the topics that we cover in the podcast, to go a little bit more in depth and to really also shine a bigger spotlight on those guests.
All right. I'm excited for it too. I think it's an excellent example of how this plan process can also lead into great collaboration opportunities. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And just a thank you. So here's some content information for myself and for Francis. Want to give a heads up on some of the upcoming sessions for next month in December around the guest and host experience. And again, there's that QR code just to sign up for some other resources. But I'm going to give maybe 5 more seconds for some questions, or 10 seconds. I just don't see any questions yet in the chat. But Francis, as we're waiting, do you have anything else you want to mention?
Oh man, the pressure is on. I don't think so. It's definitely been a learning process for me. This is my 3rd season hosting the podcast, and as we have been talking about, the sort of planning and theming process has definitely evolved, and I think it's going in a great direction. I personally do love having a theme for the season. I think, as Robert has mentioned, it lets guests know what to expect. I think it makes it easier to identify guests who are just really a great fit for that topic. And so I think the episodes are much more informative and the guests are much more comfortable because they're talking about something that's in their wheelhouse. And I'm excited to explore a little bit more this idea of these micro themes to really target in on a smaller topic that is, even though the topic is smaller, the reach is larger. Something that really is identifiable, that impacts a lot of people. And I'm hoping that that will help us capture a larger audience and really be a value add for them.
Amazing. I'm all for it. So I think at this point, if you have any questions, you got our contact info here, so feel free to reach out. But we're going to close it. So Francis, thank you for spending your Friday with us. and everybody else for spending your Friday with us.
Thank you for having me.